you, Greg. Thank you, Linda, for leading us in worship this morning. Thank you for the beautiful music. This morning, if you've got your Bible, turn with me to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16. Mark chapter 16. This morning, we will read the first 8 verses of that chapter. I'll give you just a moment to turn there and follow along as I read, starting in verse 1 of Mark chapter 16. Gospel says that when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They'd been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there's the place that they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And all that had been commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter. And afterward, Jesus himself sent out through them, from east to west, the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Let's pray over those words for just a moment. Lord, we thank you for this account, for this story, and we thank you that it is not mere fiction, but it is truth. We thank you that Christ is risen. We thank you for all that that means, for all the implications that it brings. We thank you for those throughout the generations who have brought this good news to a hungry world, a world desperately needing to hear it. And Lord, I pray that we would join their ranks as we leave this place, that just as the women proclaimed the gospel when they left the tomb, that we too would leave with this glorious message that Christ is risen. It's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen. This changes everything. That became something of a tagline, something of a trademark phrase for Steve Jobs when he was the CEO and co-founder and public face of Apple. Y'all have seen on the news how every time a new Apple device comes out, and this is something dating back to his tenure, there will be a big conference. And the media will come, and all the employees of Apple will come, and just fans will come to hear what the latest gadget's going to be this year. And sometimes you're underwhelmed. Sometimes it's just a new version of something that already existed with a slightly better camera and a little bit more memory, and everyone walks away saying, "Well, I'm going to buy it, but it's not that exciting." But every now and then, a few times during his tenure, Steve Jobs would get up there and he would say these words, "This changes everything." And he would introduce the iPod, or the iPhone, or the iPad, or going back to the very beginning, the Macintosh. And when he would say these words, and when he would unveil this new product, it would inspire a lot of different responses. It would inspire questions. With the iPod, people wondered, how's this going to affect the music industry? Having this little device that can hold so much music in a device this small, what's it going to do to the music industry? For the iPhone, how can a device so small do so much? And what's it going to mean for our productivity? And what's it going to mean for our time wasting? The iPad, how's this going to affect laptop computers? Will it replace them altogether? Will it just become another version? And with everything, Who's going to pay for this stuff? The answer to Apple's joy was a lot of people. But there were a lot of questions whenever Steve Jobs would unveil a new product and say these words that this changes everything. It would inspire questions and also inspire excitement. I'm sure y'all have seen each time one of these products comes out on the news, the lines that go for hundreds of yards just to get in, just to be the first ones to have the new gadget. The hundreds of orders that would be placed the day these products were unveiled. And, of course, just the big crowds at these unveilings to begin with. Yeah, these words, this changes everything, and then a look at what it was that changes everything, it inspired a lot of response. But however people felt, once Jobs had acquired something of a reputation as an innovator, people stopped doubting the words. They believed him when he said, whatever the new device was, they believed that this would change everything. If this device worked as advertised, this would change the game. Today, we are gathered together to celebrate a different kind of unveiling, a different kind of announcement. Not a revolutionary product, but a risen person. But despite the obvious difference, in some ways, the message is the same. This changes everything. The resurrection of Jesus Christ changes everything. The world before the empty tomb is not the same world as the world after the empty tomb. This changes everything. So how are we supposed to respond? What do we do with this message? What do we do with this good news, this gospel that Christ is risen? How do we respond? For the answer to that, I want to look this morning to the women who were the first to hear this good news, and then the first to share it with others. Let's look to how they respond. You may remember that these women are some of the same who were at the foot of the cross, even as Jesus bled and died. That some of these women were the same who had arranged with Joseph of Arimathea to ensure that Jesus was buried properly and that it was done by the Sabbath. And then these women came to the tomb expecting to attend to the body once more, to pay their respects, and perhaps to begin to move on with their lives. But then they got there, chatting the whole way about, what are we going to do when we get there? We don't have the ability to roll this heavy stone away from the door. We probably ought to develop a plan along the way, and upon arriving, see that no plan was needed. The stone was already rolled away. And a man in white, typically identified as an angel, gave them the good news. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said. So then we get their response. Because he told them in verse 7, listen again, go and tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you'll see him just as he told you. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. See, the message was now theirs to do with what they would, and the same goes for us. And that initial response is, in my mind, a little bit underreported. That they fled in terror and amazement, and that initially they didn't say a word to anybody because they were afraid. We don't talk about that part all that much, because when you read that on Easter morning, it doesn't really fit the happy springtime narrative that we're all about on this most joyous of days. Leaving and not telling anybody a word about Jesus, that's not really what we're trying to get across on Easter Sunday. So we jump to the latter half of that verse pretty darn quick. and understandably so. That's the tidier narrative, that they got the good news, Christ is risen, and they were filled with joy, and they couldn't wait to tell the world. That's a lot simpler, and that's a lot more comfortable. Even better, we like John's account where Mary Magdalene, after telling them, sticks around for a little while, and Jesus himself shows up. So we get that living in person proof that Christ is risen. Jesus there to comfort her, Jesus there to personally give her the good news. All of that was going to come. The telling of the disciples, Jesus appearing to Mary and appearing to the disciples, all of that was to come. But first we have to deal with the reality of that initial response. They were afraid. That's what came first. They were afraid of what they'd been told. Because they'd seen Jesus die. The crucifixion was not just a report for them. It was not secondhand news. They had seen it with their own eyes. They had heard the last words of Jesus from the cross. They had seen him take his dying breath. They had helped to carry his body to his tomb. They had been there for the burial. They knew he was dead. And now they'd come to pay their respects. They'd come to seek some kind of closure. And instead, what they got was a message from a stranger. A message that all of a sudden, everything has changed. Everything has changed. And they were afraid. When you're overwhelmed, no matter how excited you are, or how excited you know you should be, a lot of times fear is the first reaction. When you get news that is just so big, so life-changing, so overwhelming, you can't help but be a little bit afraid. I remember when I was 11 years old, I joined the Boy Scouts, and about 2 weeks later, it was time to go to Boy Scout camp. At 11 years old, I was by far the youngest one going, and there were all these 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds who felt like giants to me. I didn't know a soul. They were cooler than I could ever hope to be, and I knew they weren't going to say a word to me. I was excited to go to camp. It was something I knew I would enjoy, but when the day finally came and I saw these guys, and I saw the big trailer, and I thought about how long I was going to be away from home, it all hit me like a ton of bricks. You know what I did? I went to the bathroom, sat in a stall for about 15 minutes, wondering how I was possibly going to get out of this. I was pretty sure it'd be fun once I got there. I was pretty sure I'd have a good time, and I believed my parents that I'd make friends along the way. But in that moment, I wasn't feeling any of those good feelings. I was just scared. I was just worried. Dad found me. So eventually, people started to wonder where Daniel was. Dad found me, and I still remember what he told me when I explained why I was hiding in the bathroom stall. He told me, son, it's okay to be afraid. But don't let the fear stop you from doing what you need to do. On Easter Sunday, we are celebrating a monumental truth: that Christ is risen. That he is not buried, he is not dead, Christ is risen. That sin has been overcome, that death has been defeated, that God has conquered the powers of darkness, and that love is victorious. That's the message of Easter, and if you believe that to be true, then that means you believe that the resurrection changes everything. Your life can't be the same after hearing that kind of a message. You can't just go back to the way things were after hearing that sin and death have been conquered, that God is victorious over all, and that we have living proof of that. This changes everything, and it is good news. make no mistake, it's also scary. Because it's a change. And change is scary. It's okay to be afraid. But don't let the fear stop you from doing what God has called you to do. It didn't stop the women at the tomb, at least not for long. Initially, they left and didn't say a word to anybody because they were afraid. But then the verse continues, and we find out that they did tell. Gospel accounts differ. The 4 different gospel accounts. They differ on the details of Easter morning. But after all, none of the gospel writers were there to see it. So we get different accounts of which women were there. In Mark's gospel, you've read with me that Mary Magdalene was there, Mary the mother of James was there, and Salome was there. In Matthew's account, Salome gets the boot. She doesn't get mentioned. Luke keeps the same list as Matthew, but he adds Joanna to the list. And curiously, John only mentions Mary Magdalene. Nobody else makes the cut. We've got different accounts there. We've also got different accounts of what they found when they got there. In John, it's just an empty tomb. In Luke, there's 2 men dressed in white, presumed to be angels. And in Matthew and Mark, it's just one. And Matthew says that there was an earthquake that rolled the stone away. So harmonizing these accounts with their differing little details is tricky work. But the 4 Gospels are very unanimous on this most important detail. That these women were the first to discover the empty tomb, and that upon discovering it, they told other people what they'd seen. That these women were the very first to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. Though they initially greeted the news of Christ's resurrection with fear, it didn't take long before that fear was transformed into purpose. Andrew's at that age now where fear of the dark is starting to work its way in. It's not a big problem, but every now and then when he sees a dark room and is told to go in there, he'll comment on it. It's too dark. It's dark in there. Lindsay and I already figured out the trick to getting him in there despite the darkness. Give him a job. Go in your closet. It's dark in there. Daddy needs a book from the closet. Go get a book for Daddy. And off he goes. It's amazing the power that purpose has to overcome our fears. The resurrection of Jesus changes everything, and you can internalize that. It can cause you to freeze at first. You don't know what to do with that kind of news. You don't know how you're supposed to respond. It's overwhelming. It's a little bit frightening. Or you can be obedient to God's command and turn that fear into a sense of purpose. Because resurrection is good news. And good news is meant to be shared. For y'all, for you individually, it's possible that Easter is just a holiday. You can look within your own heart and answer that for yourself. Easter may just be a holiday for you. It may be something that's about gathering with family. And that's really what it's all about. It can be something that's about the arrival of springtime. And that's really what Easter's all about. It can be about a day where you go out and buy a pretty dress, or you buy a new tie and you show it off to your friends and family. And that can be what Easter's about. Easter can be just a holiday. Because maybe for you, on this Easter Sunday, in a sense, it's really still Saturday night. It's still Saturday night. Because you look at the world, and things seem to be getting worse, not better. And you try, and you try, and you try to do the right thing, and you just can't quite seem to get it right. And you feel, for all the world, like you are on your own. And this message about resurrection and hope and victory just doesn't quite resonate with your life. And you say, it's still Saturday night where I live. And as scary as that can be, as overwhelming as that can be, at least it's predictable. At least you know what to expect when you're trapped in Saturday night. You know what you're going to get. Faith isn't predictable. A risen Lord is not predictable. So maybe you're like the women and you really just showed up today to pay your respects. That's why you're in church this Easter Sunday. Maybe you're not quite ready for a risen Lord and all that means. But let me tell you, in the name of God, ready or not, here he comes. It's not Saturday anymore, folks. It is Easter Sunday morning. Morning has broken. Death has been defeated by the Lord of life. Sin has been subdued by the righteous Redeemer. Despair has given way to hope. Agony has been replaced by joy, and hatred has been pushed to the side by love. As dark as the world can seem sometimes, light has broken through, and the shadows are helpless before the sun. Ready or not, Saturday is over. It is Easter Sunday. Christ is risen. And that changes everything. Nothing is the same as it was before. If that's scary, if that's a lot to take in, it's okay. Change is scary. But don't let fear blind you to truth. Don't let fear hold you captive when Christ is offering you freedom from fear. The women on that first Easter Sunday, they fled from the tomb in terror. But somewhere along the way, somewhere in their flight from that grave, somewhere along the way, perfect love cast out fear, just like Jesus had promised would happen. Everything had changed, and that went for them too. Somewhere in that flight from the tomb, they went from being mourners to missionaries. The resurrection changes everything. It can change you too. It can change even your fear into purpose.